If we're sitting in London or New York, one of the most difficult parts of this, Felix, to understand is the role of Pakistan. Can you describe to me why it is that the Pakistanis seem to say one thing and do something else?
I think in many ways they do. They often say one thing and then do another. In terms of what they have been doing in Afghanistan and their involvement with various militant groups, they have been very consistent. To Pakistan, really, this is part of their vital national interest and their national security. It has much to do with their relationship with India around the ongoing conflict concerning Kashmir, which time and again has caused in an outbreak of war between the two nations. For them, calling up on tribal groups and militant groups which are allowed to operate within the tribal region is something that come in very handy and has happened in the past, that they call on these groups to help them out. One of their biggest fears, which is generally termed in their strategy of strategic depth, is that an encirclement, that in Afghanistan could come to be that has a strategic alliance with India, which sees Pakistan being encircled on two fronts, and there are various other big problems concerning the borders with Afghanistan, for example. That one of the biggest ethnic group within Afghanistan is the Pashtuns, but their territory actually of the Pashtun nation, so to say, has been split by the Durand line, which forms the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So there are a lot of Pashtuns who consider this border to be not legitimate, and see in the future down the line a Pashtun nation, yeah, which would chop off a third of Pakistan quite easily. So Pakistan has been quite consistent in terms of how they acted with these groups. They have been quite inconsistent in a way for us in terms of how they communicate with us or how they communicate with the United States. Yeah. This again goes back to a very complicated relationship with the United States, where Pakistan often doesn't see that the United States actually is a true ally which will stick with them.
But the difficulty is if you take $1 billion from somebody, they might expect you to behave in a fairly straightforward way, because that's a lot of money and a lot of
but we are alliance. In the realm of international politics and relations, right?
Sure. But nonetheless, that is the primary tension, isn't it? The primary tension is between taking a lot of money and saying you're going to do one thing and actually perceiving your interests to lie elsewhere.
Yes, of course, but I mean, I think it's in a lot of ways what we're seeing time and again is sort of like a compromise, which isn't ideal for anyone, specifically not for the United States in a lot of cases. But there aren't too many other options out there. Since if you look at it, the alternatives seem to be far more gruesome than what we're having right now. We're talking about Pakistan. It's a nuclear. They have nuclear weapons, standing against India, who have nuclear weapons. So it's a very different idea to go to war with Pakistan as a nation, vice versa going to war with Afghanistan as a nation, which has a bunch of AK-47s and a couple of PKs screwed onto an old Jeep. So in terms of cutting ties completely, this can have a disastrous effect, and I think Pakistan right now really is in absolute turmoil. What we've been seeing developing over the past few months is of great concern, but then again, it's also it's a time of change, which is good because in a way there is at least a perspective that there could be an end to sort of a stalemate which has been going on between like the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military.
Bring us up to date. The Taliban were eventually militarily beaten and then revived themselves both politically and militarily. Where are we now? What is the balance of forces politically and militarily?
Yeah, they revived themselves. I mean, as we all know, 2001 came to pass, and Operation Enduring Freedom saw basically the Taliban movement collapse within months. Was the senior leadership fleeing over the border into Pakistan, and a lot of the foot soldiers actually just going home and sitting down. There was genuine happiness. I think the great majority of Afghans was very happy about the change and belief that there is a real real opportunity here for everyone for a better future. I think a lot of this didn't really come to pass in the end. I think it changed within the opinions, or difficult to grasp from the distance, but like there was a change of opinions after 2-3 years in terms of like, you know, there was very little materializing, and a lot of the people who seemed to come to be in charge didn't really bring about any change. Actually, what came to be was very corrupt government on a very local level, actually. That sort of intersected with the Taliban having been able to kind of like reconsolidate themselves within Pakistan and decided to start an insurgent war, or a war against the new Afghan government and their foreign supporters. And that gathered a lot of momentum. There was a lot of grievances against local governments and so forth. So let's fast forward this from 2003 to, let's say, 2010, where we had, throughout Afghanistan, the Taliban managed to establish a shadow government, more or less. They put in place courts in a lot of places. They have military operations close to throughout the country, and claim support of often like 2/3 of the country, and find a lot of local support at times, or manage to you know, put people under their power at least. What we've seen with the Afghan Taliban the last few years, specifically since the arrival of General McChrystal, there was like was the surge and there was a readjustment in the tactics. There was a real upsurge of not just of the amount of troops, but also of the amount of target operations, like kill and capture, or night raids as they're called, taking out basic leaders of the Taliban or anyone they could get hold of. With this, we have seen a quite significant change within the Taliban over the recent years. That's one of the things we should bear in mind, even if we talk about Mullah Omar in 1994, Mullah Omar in 1999, and Mullah Omar today. These are not static entities and not static personalities, and you can actually take yourself always as example. You're not the same person as you were when you were 22. With these operations of kill and capture, we have seen really hundreds and thousands of commanders being taken out. There's a lot of new and young people coming into the Taliban movement on a field level who do the military operations, who seem to be changing in terms of their worldview when we talk about the far enemy, the near enemy, and the ideology. The Afghan Taliban have been very exclusively focused on Afghanistan. The younger generation seems to be more open-minded towards or changing their idea of what kind of conflict they actually find themselves in. And groups like Al-Qaeda, like the few which are still around, and there are other groups in the region who have a more international global outlook, are known to make efforts to connect with these young generation commanders and kind of like give them more than just moral support, and kind of like educate them towards what kind of conflict they find themselves actually in. There has been a real impact on the movement, while the pace of operations hasn't really significantly slowed, even though there can be a case made that they have since the summer, but there are arguments around that. There has been a real impact, and that is something that has also been noted by the senior leadership, the old one, who are by now in their mid-40s, 50s, have kids, have children, have a family, and have been fighting for decades. So that is something they do not want. I think all Afghans agree, whether you're a Northern Alliance commander, or you're a Taliban commander, or you're a Haqqani commander, nobody seems to be particularly interested into a revival of the early 1990s, a full-scale civil war, which sees hundreds and thousands of people fleeing and dying. And I think that's the lowest common denominator, and something a lot of people come together around. With the latest developments of the announcement that the Afghan Taliban are going to open an office in Qatar, the United States has been continuously talking over the last few years with the Taliban, as has the German government and other governments. I think there are relatively hopeful signs that we finally come around to accept that a lot of this conflict, that this conflict actually isn't a military conflict but a political one, and that we need to seek a political solution if we want to avoid further and far more far greater conflict than we're witnessing today.
Alex, turning to you for the final question. What will happen once the Americans leave Afghanistan? Will it be the same as when the Soviets left? There seems to be a sort of developing argument that, actually it'll go back to where it was before.
Well, I mean, there was a line in a kind of a recent article which came out that the Americans could only dream to have it go as it did when they left. I mean, certainly when you look at from the Afghan army to the state of government bureaucracy, a whole bunch of indicators on no level are we in as good a state as the kind of the Afghan state was at the end of the 1980s. I mean, there you could talk about a real functioning state and an army which was well trained, at least to a decent degree, and so on. And yeah, I mean, what happens in 2014? It's yes, of course, looking into the crystal ball a bit. The way it looks at the moment is yes, I mean, a similar kind of plan whereby essentially either through some kind of top level agreements brought about through kind of diplomatic negotiation process with this Taliban office in Qatar and so on, as well as military ground realities whereby either US forces or militias, in all but name, installed in the places where they leave, can kind of clamp down on things for at least a little bit of time for international forces to leave. Of course, even when we get to 2014 or even 2015, there are still going to be foreign forces in Afghanistan. There's still going to be foreigners in Afghanistan. I mean, all indications are that America, at the very least, wants to keep special forces troops within the country. They want to keep bases from which to launch kind of drone capacity over Pakistan, and to have all of these things. Of course, this is
so it's not quite the same as when the Soviets left.
No, it's not. We won't have a last man out.
Yeah.
I mean, even Iraq had its last man out moment, but there are still over 20,000-30,000 Americans, contractors and so on. It has the largest embassy in terms of staff in the world. So I mean, in Afghanistan, there is still going to be a retained presence, but all the signs, while all of these things are the ideal solution and so on, in terms of long-term sustainability of that, it's more difficult to see a kind of rosy outlook. We have all of the outlines of a return to, or essentially a continuation of where we are already, which is essentially kind of ongoing conflict between various parties within Afghanistan, which at some point could flame up even more.
Alex and Felix, thanks for talking to me today.
You're welcome.